take a look at the supply chain relationships in the aftermath of an important event, a major contract breach. An example of a major breach could be that a customer firm fails to pay or a supplier firm fails to deliver products as stated in the contract. A contract breach, especially a major one, of course, so has negative consequences and present a shock to an ongoing relationship. So when one party fails to deliver his promise, trust is shattered. And so naturally we are left with the question, will the other party continue the relationship after such an event? And more importantly, why and when? So this question is even more critical when it comes to the major breach in financial contracts with the finance provider, which is our context. Because a disruption in the relationships between firms and their finance providers may not only affect the financial health of the firm, but also creates financial instability for their supply chains.
Yes. So usually we think about business-to-business relationships like having a life cycle. And the concept of life cycle actually comes from biology, where we have a birth, a growth, a maturity, a decline, and eventually a death. But business-to-business relationships don't necessarily have to behave fully in each of those stages of the life cycle. Usually conflicts in business-to-business relationships receive quite a bit of attention, and rightly so. And with this paper, what we showed is that trustworthiness, which is basically usually we view trust from the point of view of someone that trusts you, but here trustworthiness is a property that you reflect, how trustworthy you show to others. So we show that trustworthiness plays an important role in the event of a conflict, which for this paper, we used a conflict as the contract breach. Relationships, rather than declining and dying, might continue and eventually revive, right? Like the phoenix bird, and become a completely, because the life cycle may start again, a completely new life cycle.
Yes, so the idea of this research came to me because I was interested in financial supply chain management, in which we study how to manage financial flows within a supply chain. It is a new and emerging area in supply chain literature. We all know that supply chain management requires the effective management of three primary flows: products and services, information, and financial flow. However, we mostly focus on the supply chain, the management of product and services, as well as the information. Well, financial flow, despite being very important, has not been studied much, and firms and supply chains cannot exist without capital resources. So understanding how to preserve the finance source is important, especially after a negative event. Now, the intersection between supply chain and finance to me is very important and interesting one. The financial health of companies in a supply chain is increasingly interdependent and interconnected. Take an example, Toys R Us recent default not only forced the company out of business, but also triggered a chain of bankruptcies for its suppliers. So if we could understand what would help Toys R Us retain its financial resources after the first breach, it could also help the whole supply chain.
Well, I was very glad that my other co-authors invited me to participate in this research, particularly because I'm originally from Argentina, and in 2001 there was a pretty big economic crisis in Argentina. What happened? It happened a lot of things, but one of the things that happened was that the financial flows in the supply chain were cut. There was so much uncertainty, and there were so many problems that customers stopped paying suppliers. Okay, and that was a ripple effect in many industries. What I observed, and something that it has been puzzling me for quite some time, is that that's a pretty serious thing, right? That a customer does not pay you, and just put yourself in that situation where you don't know when you're gonna receive the payment, and you have to respond to your suppliers. So in that scenario, many relationships terminated. They stopped, right? They were serious. However, after the wounds have healed, some customers and suppliers came back to work together, leaving that wound behind. Okay. Now, all these to me was anecdotes. So when the first time I heard about this project on trustworthiness, in particularly in the context of contract breaches, I thought it was, well, this hits home to me because trustworthiness, basically the way the relationship terminated, could be a possible explanation of why some customers and suppliers went back to working together, and some did not.
Yeah, so the method was interesting because we basically pulled together data sources from several secondary data sources. So I was really, one of the indicators of trustworthiness that we use in this research was credit ratings of a firm, and it's not perfect at all. Whenever you do research where you're looking at secondary data, sometimes you have to use proxies, and you have to, use a measure as an indicator of something else. And so in this study, we used Moody's credit ratings as an indicator or proxy for trustworthiness of an organization. And there's been a lot of research that has established that credit ratings are considered to be one of the most prominent objective measures of trustworthiness. And so we were able to pull information on credit ratings for different companies. We did this in the banking sector, which that in and of itself was interesting because we were looking into more of the financial infrastructure of supply chains. So really digging more into the financial relationship infrastructure, not just product or manufacturing. And we then had a database that we were able to patch to those relationships to see whether or not relationships would occur or not. So we did some, of course, analyses of that data to see whether or not there was relationships between those constructs. But from a methodological perspective, we did pull together several different data sources and to create the data that we then analyzed to test the hypotheses.
So we examined the Kyber data 124 relationships between customer firms and finance providers. And we found that a customer firm's trustworthiness, meaning how trustworthy a firm is critical to the finance provider decision to continue the relationship after a major breach. Now, what is noteworthy in the findings is that it's not the trustworthiness level after the breach that is critical, but it is the magnitude of change and the direction of change of trustworthiness before and after the breach that matters. In other words, the study component of trustworthiness, which is usually what we study in the current literature, is not as important as a dynamic change of trustworthiness in this context. And we were able to capture that. Also, the change is more critical when breaches occur earlier in the relationships, meaning when the relationships are relatively new to both parties. And also the finance providers are also more likely to rely on the changes in trustworthiness when the breaches are less severe, meaning when they incur insignificant losses.
Well, we did find, as I alluded to, that changes in trustworthiness were in fact impactful in terms of relationship continuity. We also found that there was kind of an interesting increase in the effects. And so, in other words, when there were positive changes in trustworthiness, but the magnitude of that change was relatively low, the effect on relationship continuity was positive, but it wasn't that significant, or not. It wasn't a big change in the likelihood of relationship continuity. However, when those changes in trustworthiness were quite large and positive, the effects on relationship continuity really did kind of have an upward trend there. And so, in essence, what we found was that even some small to maybe negligible changes in trustworthiness might not be robust enough to affect the likelihood of relationship continuity. Those changes really do have to be significant. We also looked at some moderators. Different conditions under which that relationship between trustworthiness change and relationship continuity might be different. And one of the things that we found, which was interesting, was that for relationships where the breach occurred early on in the relationship, we saw a much stronger correlation between trustworthiness change and relationship continuity. For those longer lasting, longer term relationships when there was a breach, just the effects of trustworthiness change were not so great. So in other words, we also found that the predictive ability of trustworthiness change really differs depending upon how long that relationship had existed if there is a breach. And those are some of the key findings that we got out of that work.
I think for practitioners, the most important insight from this study is that signaling trustworthiness to the partner is critical, especially when an unfortunate event such as failure to keep promise occurs. Now, it is worthwhile for customer firms to keep a conscious focus on how trustworthy they are perceived by their supply chain partners, and also for them to regularly assess and signal their trustworthiness to their partners, because again, it is the change over time that matters.
The paper shows that how trustworthiness change, how much it changes, and the speed at which it changes has an impact on relationship continuity. I believe that what can practitioners think about from this idea, extending what it says on the paper, is that it matters the way you handle a problem in a business to business relationship. That if you handle the problem the right way, whatever that means, then there is a higher chance for relationship continuing, if that's what you want, if that's what the person that created the conflict or the organization that created the conflict wants. So I believe that a follow-up idea from this, at least from my experience, is that it matters how you handle a problem. So problems happen, and the way you handle the problem, the way you face the problem, communicate, are open about it, provide the right information, whatever the situation requires. But the way you handle that conflict may actually have an impact on the chances of the relationship continuing.
Yeah, so a few things. Number one, I think just really this whole notion of trustworthiness, really this notion that relationship partners really do, that there's a likelihood that it's not just about trust, it's also about being able to convey trustworthiness, which would essentially stimulate another party's trust in you as an entity. So I think from a takeaway perspective, I mean, we were able to show number one that one of the ways to really stabilize relationships is by conveying trustworthiness and by conveying positive changes in trustworthiness. So really focusing on things that you can do as an organization to convey to your supply chain partners that you are trustworthy, that you are able to do what you say you're going to do, that you're able to follow through on your commitments. These are things that, although they seem to be relatively, it's like inevitable or like, duh, of course, we found that, there are levels to trustworthiness. Not every entity has the same level of trustworthiness. So any things that organizations can do to really lift that, that ability to convey trustworthiness, I think is quite important. In another kind of indirect way, we also, by digging into Moody's and how they do their credit ratings, we were able to uncover some really interesting methodological things that they do to kind of determine how they will rate companies from a creditworthiness perspective. And so again, creditworthiness is not exactly trustworthiness, but it's a really good proxy because they use quantitative as well as qualitative insights to assign those ratings. And so we also suggested that organizations could adopt a similar methodology to try to put more of a real objective assessment to how trustworthy their suppliers are, how trustworthy their customers are, and really use a methodology that has been shown to work in the financial services industry. We could also use that same methodology when we're talking about part suppliers, commodity suppliers, or retail customers, for example, in other types of supply chains.
So I think the two most important areas for future research based on this study is financial supply chain management and supply chain relationships. Now, first again, financial supply chain management is very important, but literature on this subject is very rudimentary. So our paper just focused on the very upstream of the financial chain and on how a firm could retail the financial resources after a breach. How to effectively manage and retail the financial flows throughout the chain remain unanswered for future studies. And so secondly, the relationship theory says that relationships are dynamic, but how could we capture that dynamic that change over time with just static constructs? Our study shows that changes in trustworthiness is indeed critical and relevant. So building on our findings, I think that future research can really investigate the dynamic components of relational construct that we all know, like trust, commitment, and how they affect relational and behavioral outcomes as well as supply chain performance.
Yeah, so I think where I'd like to see this research go is of course, as I alluded to, we use secondary data sources on trustworthiness, which we're not perfect. I'd like to see more work that really does develop really good, solid measures of trustworthiness. I think trustworthiness is such an important construct because it really does get at the heart of relationship stability. And again, we use a secondary data approach and use creditworthiness as a proxy for trustworthiness. So, the links are not, perfect. So I'd like to see more research on that. I would also like to see more research, and I hope that we build on this, that really focuses on those change constructs. As I indicated, we didn't just focus on trustworthiness, but trustworthiness change. And I think that's important because relationships are dynamic. They change over time. There's been some really good work by one of my co-authors and colleagues, Chad Autry and Susan Galisic, where they looked at kind of relationships over time. And the reality is that, these relationships aren't static. They just don't stay the same. And so I think we need to see more research that really does look longitudinally at relationship constructs to really focus on how things change and how the rate of change might affect what partners do in supply chains.